Her name was Christina Saracet. She was a very remarkable person. Her remarkableness lay in the extraordinary and, to me, enchanting discrepancy between her external behavior and her inner self. Imagine a bulldog whose ferocious exterior covers a heart tender to the point of sentimentality, and you have Christina Saracet. She was my great aunt and the oldest person I ever met. This is hardly surprising since she was born in 1846 and died last year at the age of 94, grievously disappointed that she could not make the century. Her life, both in the living and the recounting of it, was in the eyes of her family, compact of adventure and romance. Only those 6 years were lacking to make the picture complete. It was in 1844 that my great-grandfather, with his young wife, sailed from England to Australia to cover health after a long illness. On arrival, he made a prompt recovery, seized a huge tract of virgin forest with the grandiose simplicity of a rubber baron, and built himself a mansion in the wilderness. Whether he really intended to live there, nobody really knows, but the appearance of the inevitable new baby compelled him to settle down. Soon there was a large Victorian family growing up among the Bushmen in rugged pioneering splendor. Christina headed the list. It was at her instigation that all the children were sent backward and forward on the voyage between Australia and England to be educated. I refused to be brought up like a savage, she is reported to have said, and her father, already sensing the bulldog in her, hastened to charter a vessel. Aunt Sass, as we all called her, would remember for her numerous great nieces and nephews wonderful excursions when a ship took 3 months sailing to England, when there was no Suez Canal and the desert between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean had to be crossed on muleback. Her stories of those days, like all her reminiscences, were original and intensely personal. There was little in them of the beauties of nature or the joys of youth. They were pithy tracts of moral behavior and solid fact. Right and wrong were Aunt Sass's favorite subjects. Her remembrance of the Sphinx was that the huge, ugly thing terrified your great Aunt Jane. They had no right to put it there, just where people are passing. Of the pyramids, all she had to say was that your great Uncle Robert was disappointed and that they were not larger. And all the glories of Sydney Harbor were as nothing compared to the fact that your great-grandfather lost a silver crown piece in it. One day, when he was sailing, I used to think of the harbor floor as paved with silver because of great-grandfather's coin. That was Aunt Sass. Everything in the world came back to herself or her family. She used notable people simply as a background for her own life. Her family was hung about with great occasions as Indians with wampum. The universe and the other unknown words swung about the central pivot of Aunt Sass and those nearest to her. She numbered among her friends many of the great figures of her time, but she saw them not as creatures of history or fate, merely as beings whose human significance lay in their intimate relation to herself. Thus Stericelli was less a statesman than the man who rode the hounds beside her in yellow trousers and black button boots. And Queen Victoria, for all Aunt Sass's ardent royalism, was chiefly remarkable for the fact that she preferred salt on her oatmeal to sugar, just like your great-grandmother. Her historical facts were equally Irrelevant, having presided as it were almost at the inception of a great commonwealth, the things she remembered best were its small domestic oddities. That fish and milk carts were drawn by dogs because of the horses that people going out to dinner parties, even to Government House, carried their own bread with them. She never explained the reason for the latter custom, and it was not until later that the vision of Aunt Sass setting out for Government House, all lace and taffeta with a loaf of bread under one arm, ceased to be funny. Brooding over her reminiscences, I realized that in those days the clearings in the bush must still have been small and scanty. Much time and energy are necessary to make wattle and eucalyptus give way to wheat and rye. Bread, therefore, must have been infinitely precious. But most exciting of her reminiscences was one that told how, wine being costly and difficult to obtain, many low persons, of whom Aunt Sass could have known only by hearsay, drank laded spirits, and this to such excess that they had only to strike a match for their lips to flare up in blue flame. And many of them, Aunt Sass would conclude disgustedly, many of them were women. We trembled deliciously at the pictures, imagining rows upon rows of women burning like candles in their doorways. Aunt Sass, it was rumored, had once been in love with a prominent member of the government of that day. He was her cousin, and for this reason it was said she would not, or felt she could not, marry him. Nobody knew the rights of this story, for she kept her own secrets closely. The rumor and the pictures it projected were springboards for family witnesses Aunt Sass in love. Think of it. Nevertheless, for me, there was something about her. Something that breathed through the tough outer body, an air, a scent, a whisper, the unmistakable essence of one whom love has struck on the heart. Occasionally, in an old barn, you become aware, though the scent has long since vanished, that once was there. Apples in the loft. Aunt Sass was like that. But though she remained unmarried, her spinsterhood never succeeded in damming up her activities. She was a born matriarch and used the children and grandchildren of her brothers and sisters for her own domestic purposes. Each new child was taken to be looked over by Aunt Sass, much as the children of old were carried to the temple to be blessed. If the child pleased her, its future was assured. In fact, she had two brothers. Aunt Sass assumed the position and privileges of head of the family when her father died, and retained them until she herself followed him to the vault. She was like the central shaft of a merry-go-round. When her whistle blew, the family revolved about her like so many wooden horses. Only the hardiest had courage to flower that fierce face and the deep voice like the sound of a bass viol. But there had their reward, for they were the ones who came nearest to her heart. She respected courage above all things, and from behind that exterior would watch it with a heart melting with pride and gentleness. But if anybody hinted at the existence of such sentiment, she would go to the most devious lengths to deny it. She not only did good and blushed to find it fame, she did good and was ready to vilify anybody who discovered it. It was her habit to disapprove of all suggestions and projects on principle. Idiotic nonsense, she would shout, but as likely as not would send a check for the furthering of them. She calmly disinherited a great niece of 4, because the child kissing her goodnight remarked, "Oh, Aunt Sass, your mustache does prick." But she balanced fate by showering the delinquent with such gifts that when Aunt Sass died, the disinherited one was found to have received more than her rightful share. I never mention anything I want in front of your Aunt Sass, Great Aunt Jane used to say, because she merely says, "Don't be a fool, Jane," and rushes out to buy it for me. Aunt Sass had only to hear of somebody in trouble to remark with almost gleeful callousnesses that curious convulsion in her nose that was something between a snort and a sniff. "Well, they've made their bed, let them lie on it." Therefore, having thus presented herself as a complete harpy, she would secretly set about making the bed as comfortable as possible. She was already ancient when I was born, had embedded herself in the social life of two countries, England and Australia, had made the journey between them 17 times, amassed unlimited friends and memories, broken her hip and mended it at the age of 65, and written all of her reminiscences down. Later, when they came into the hands, I begged her to have them published. She reared and snorted like an angry horse. "Published? Don't be a fool. They were written to please myself, not for strange persons in bookstalls." "What? You put me in a book? I trust you will never so far forget yourself as to do anything so disrespectful." Sniff, sniff. From the first, she was for me a figure of romance. She had a tall, gaunt, gracelessness frame and grim face with a long upper lip that curled at the corners when she smiled, and a voice like the father bear's voice in the story of Goldilocks. Her face was exactly like her character, definite, sharply outlined, with no suggestion of musiness, steering a path between good and evil, had no dangers for Aunt Sass. Everything was black and white. Gray had no place in her world. I saw her as somebody very near to God, the only person who appeared to be in his confidence. He and Aunt Sass were always right, and woe betide anybody who thought differently. As far as Aunt Sass was concerned, the best things had already happened, and of course they had happened to her. The most notable experiences, the handsomest people, the grandest festivities, the gloomiest funerals, all had congregated to Aunt Sass. It was her fixed conviction that there was nothing left for anybody else. The future, as she saw it, was constantly diminishing return. After recounting some incident in her career, she would fold it up as if it were under lock and key and lock it away in her own private safe. "I can hardly imagine anything so interesting is likely to happen to you," if one commented upon any of her possessions or praised any of her photographs that stood in close military formation on her piano, mantelpiece, or table. She would report, "Well, may you say so? Quite the most beautiful person or object you are never likely to see." What was wrong with our eyes, we wondered. What indeed was wrong with life that it had allowed Aunt Sass to use up all the best bits before we arrived? It was not until we grew older that we began to perceive that in spite of Aunt Sass's appalling rightness, there might be still something left. But that very rightness, coupled with her fierceness, was a wonderful adventure for a child. The grim face was stony with conviction, the deep voice rumbled, and you felt delicate tremor of fear and anticipation fly through you. Any minute, any second, some terrible miracle might happen. Would the world fall in two if you brought her the wrong knitting needles? Would you go up in smoke if you tweaked Tinker's tail or Badger's ear? She kept a succession of small dogs, 2 by 2, and the pairs were always called Tinker and Badger, inheriting the names as though they were titles. The terror and delight of that strange manner infected all children. They adored her as something more than human. She issued orders as though she was general at the War Office, and spit spot, off you went, trembling to carry them out or perish. Something she would communicate with you in doggerel voice make up on the spot, her voice rumbling, her eyes snapping. I looked through the window, and what did I see? A bad little boy who wouldn't eat his tea. I said, I will spank him and send him to bed. But I gave him a large chocolate drop instead. Or she would give her own sudden, unexpected twist to nursery rhymes, far more exciting than the known and expected rhyme. Little Bo Peep has lost her sheep and can't tell where to find them. Leave them alone and they'll come home, saying, what a thoroughly careless little girl. Or Augustus was a chubby lad, fat, ruddy cheeks Augustus had, and everybody saw with joy the disgustingly overfed, unhealthy-looking child. Every time a new baby came to our family, I, being the oldest, was sent to Aunt Sass. Whether as a means of preserving the other children or as a treat for myself, I never found out. But treat it was. It was a long overnight journey after the guard had put me to bed on the luggage rack in his van. I would lie listening to the train shrieking its lonely whistle through the lonely night, seeing it cut its own way through the forest, feeling that its sole purpose was to carry me safely to Aunt Sass. It was as though she had all power and had sent the train for me. It was an iron thread, a fairy necklace stretched between the bulky body of my mother and the skinny frame of Aunt Sass. And as always at the end of the journey, there she would be, the tall, belligerent figure faithfully waiting, an ivory and ebony stick in its hand, a hat with two pigeons' wings on its head. One wing would have been enough for anybody else. Aunt Sass had to have two. The greeting was always the same. Here you are at last. The train was half a minute late. Very careless. Now I trust you will be a well-behaved little girl and give Elizabeth no trouble. Elizabeth was her personal maid, as old as Aunt Sass and even more gaunt and forbidding, and during my visits she performed the duties of nurse, performed them in an exact word, for it was a complete vaudeville act. As Elizabeth brushed my hair till it fell out, scrubbed my face till it bled, tweaked and pinched me into my clothes, and spoke of these maltreatments as her daily burden. Her daily burden. I was very glad when Elizabeth died. The only time the greeting varied was when the hat fell off as Aunt Sass bent to kiss me. She jammed it brutally back upon her head, with the pigeon's feathers facing the wrong way, and said to me furiously, "Why didn't you remind me to wear my hat pins?" Living with Aunt Sass was an adventure. When you were old enough to look with her, when you were old enough to go with her on luncheons with her, her appetite was so large that it was always touch and go whether there would be any of the best things left for you. Often I have been thankful to get the bare bones from the stew. I once saw her eat a dozen peaches at a sitting. A dozen. She then took up the last remaining peach, remarked loudly to herself, "Well, it's hardly worth leaving one," and she finished that one too. "You," she said to me, "may take an apple. Apples are good for you. They're good for your teeth." A house full of servants resolved about Aunt Sass, forming a sort of inner circle within the larger one of the family. In spite of these, she always insisted on washing the best china herself after tea. In order to preserve it, she explained, though, that she never failed to chip off the handle or crack a saucer. She also made her own marmalade for no better reason than that her mother had done so before her. She would stand over the pan, stirring and stirring the yellow mess, spilling it over the stove and blaming the cook for the stove being there to be spilt on. It was a nauseous concoction, tasting of burnt peel and oddly enough carrots. But as Aunt Sass clasped it with the VC or the ribbon of the garter and nobody except for herself, she never touched the marmalade. Her friends also were presumed to have received something in the nature of a knighthood when a pot was presented to them. Time and time again I have sat with Aunt Sass when she opened her letters and heard her remark, "Mrs. Belmore thanks me for the delicious marmalade," or so satisfying, says Colonel White Thompson. I used to wonder what Miss Belmore and the Colonel did with it, and where they would go when they died. Aunt Sass said, I could never forgive a tale-telling child, yet she herself was one of the greatest gossipers that ever breathed. Nobody's affairs were safe from her. She could keep an essential secret royally, but never, never resist speeding a rumor on its way. It was a point of honor with her to do so, rather as one redirects carrier pigeons that land on her own lawn. I once heard her telephone 25 people in one evening to tell them the news of a distant relative's runaway marriage. Marry in haste and repent at leisure. That's what I say, she remarked gleefully at the end of each conversation, having left the reputation of couple in shreds. The next day, however, I was ordered to pack up a dozen pots of marmalade to be dispatched to them special delivery, and was nearly disinherited for discovering under the smallest pot a large check made out to the lovers. When it came to an argument, Aunt Sass had profound conviction with all women, with the single exception to herself, were wrong and all the men splendidly were right. If anybody had charged her with the fact that her greatest and most subtle kindness were to women, she would have snorted and made the excuse that women, being lesser creatures, needed it more. I remember coming back from one of my grim walks with Elizabeth, and she said, God Save the King were played as we passed the church. Don't stand there like an idiot talking about stupid nonsense. They never play 3 verses of God Save the King. But they did today, Miss Sass, Elizabeth said excitedly. Hold your tongue, Elizabeth. You and the child are a pair of silly females. There's the doorbell. It's probably Major Carraway. And Major Carraway it was, cautiously tottering in on his withered old legs. Miss Sarasette, he eagerly said. I've just dropped in on my way from church, and, Major, did they or did they not play 3 verses of God Save the King? Aunt Sass looked at Elizabeth and me, ready to confound us. Oh, indeed they did, Miss Sarasette, and so beautifully, so moving. I quite agree, Major, very beautiful, especially the second verse. Aunt Sass's face was almost girlishly gay, though privately she flashed me a warning glare that defied me to say, I told you so. But tell me, Major, she went on, why did they play 3 verses? Why? But haven't you heard, Miss Sarasette? Why? Peace has been declared. Peace? The 2 pairs of old eyes gazed at each other, and the old mouths stiffened to hide their trembling. Peace? Now with childhood behind me, I could imagine their thoughts. The silent communications of Miss Sarasette and Major Carraway. For the little time that is left, said their eyes, we can sit in the sun without fear. No more sons and nephews will be taken from us. No more beautiful, bright young men. We will sit quietly, healing ourselves of the ones that we have lost, watching the grandchildren growing and life settling again into a pattern we can understand. I am part of that pattern now and can look back over its jagged, bitter shapes to the hope they had for it. But at that time, their emotion was quite incomprehensible to the children of the war. That was the place rather than an activity, the place towards which handsome young men with feathers in their hats, marched through the streets and went aboard waiting ships. When the wine came in 3 goblets, one for Major and one for Elizabeth and one for herself, then she poured a red trickle into the 4th. "Drink, child," she said gruffly, her eyes gentle with tears. "Drink, for the peace is for you." A casual observer meeting Aunt Sass for the first time might have been excused for assuming that such a grim bulldog of an old lady could have hardly a friend to her name. But the fact was that she was surrounded by literally hundreds of people to whom she was, though she seemed quite unaware of it, an object of adoration. When she came downstairs for the first time after breaking her hip, she had to slash her way through with a stick through a thick jungle of flowers. Her old postman was reported to have put in a yearly application for a larger pension because of the extra labor of carrying all of Aunt Sass's correspondence. Once, at a race meeting, I saw part of the crowd suddenly leave the rails in the middle of a race and rush toward the green. Thinking it was either royalty or an accident, I rushed too, but it was only a very old lady stalking across the grass on the arm of a jockey club steward, growling out greetings as she came. Miss Christina Saracen had decided, after 20 years of seclusion, to go to the races. None of these people, perhaps, could have explained why they loved her. She had no imagination in the accepted sense, no graceful phrases. The best she could say of a beautiful person or a lovely object was pretty. Yet the sleepless human hidden behind that crusty exterior reached out to every heart that came in contact with her. Her reaction to suffering and sorrow was direct and complete. When my father died suddenly, leaving a nursery full of young children, she traveled 700 miles through scorching subtropical country to my mother, that beloved niece whom she herself had brought up from babyhood. "Meg," she said. It was all she knew how to say, but I saw her face as the 2 women tenderly embraced. The little chestnut head went down on the gaunt square shoulder. Above it bent the sparse gray head, and the face ravaged with sorrow and compassion. In the cool, shadowy hall, smelling of sunlight and flowers, that took of hers told me what perhaps I already knew, that in the face of death there is nothing to be said.